29th of December, 2006. A payment instruction leaves the Treasury in Whitehall. $83,250,000 wired to Washington. And with that, 61 years after the gun stopped, Britain has paid off its Second World War debt. That was the headline. It is true, and it is the smallest true thing anyone can say about this. Britain repaid one loan. The debt it actually ran up to fight that war was never repaid. It was shrunk, and the people it was taken from were never asked, never consulted, and mostly not British. In the next 20 minutes, you will watch a country take a debt worth 270% of everything it produced in a year and cut it to under 50% in 30 years, while the number of pounds it owed went up the whole time. Two questions run through this, and they do not have the same answer. The first is how. How does a country carrying a debt worth nearly 3 years of its entire national output get rid of most of it without defaulting, without a write-off, and without repaying it? There is a mechanism. It is legal, it is arithmetic, and by the end of this you will be able to do it on paper. The second question is why nobody stopped it. Because a debt does not evaporate. If the borrower ends up owing less, somebody at the other end ends up holding less, and that somebody has a name, a country, and in this story, a very specific grievance. So, you're going to see the mechanism, and then you're going to see who paid for it. Those two things are not the same story. And the second one is the reason the first one worked. Start with how a government borrows, because everything after this depends on one detail. When a state issues debt, it writes down a number, not a share of the economy, not a basket of goods, a number in its own currency. 100 pounds is 100 pounds in 1945 and in 1975 and forever. That is the whole contract. Now put that number over a second number, the size of the economy that has to service it. Economists call it debt to GDP, and it is the ratio every finance ministry on earth is actually judged on. Look at what that ratio is made of. The top is fixed by contract. The bottom is not fixed by anything. The bottom is the value of everything the country produces in a year, measured in the same pounds. So there are two completely different ways to make that ratio fall. The first is the honest one. You run a surplus, you take money from taxpayers, and you hand it to bondholders until the top of the fraction is smaller. Every country talks about doing this. Almost none of them do it at the scale that matters. The second way does not require you to repay anything at all. You leave the top exactly where it is, and you make the bottom bigger. Grow the economy, and the ratio falls. That is the good version, and Britain did some of it. Or, let the price of everything go up, so that the same loaf and the same shirt and the same hour of work are now counted in more pounds. The economy has not produced one extra thing. The bottom of the fraction has gone up anyway, and the top, the debt, has not moved a penny. That is the trick. Not fraud, not default. Arithmetic. But there is a detail in it that nobody advertises, and it decides it gets hurt. The number in the ledger is fixed. The value of the pound is not. September 1945. A man of 62 is on a ship crossing the Atlantic, and he is dying. He has had a heart attack. His doctors have told him not to go. He is going anyway, because he is the only person the British government believes can talk the Americans into what Britain needs, and what Britain needs is not alone. Britain has won the war and is bankrupt. It has sold its foreign assets, mortgaged its exports, and spent 6 years buying tanks with money it did not have. John Maynard Keynes has already written down, in a memorandum for the cabinet, exactly 3 futures for his country. He calls them Starvation Corner, Temptation, and Justice. Starvation Corner is what happens if the Americans give nothing. Rationing for years. No imports, a managed decline. Temptation is a big loan on American terms, which buys time and buys nothing else. Justice is what he is sailing to ask for, and what he means by it is simple. Britain fought longer than anyone. Britain spent its own wealth first. Some of that ought to be forgiven, not lent. He will spend 3 months in Washington arguing for justice. He will come home with temptation, and he will be dead in 7 months. Here is how a country that won a war ends up borrowing from the country it won it with. Step 1. 21st of August, 1945. Japan has surrendered 6 days earlier. President Truman directs that Lend-Lease, the American program that had been shipping Britain food, oil, aircraft, and ammunition without an invoice, be discontinued immediately. Not wound down, discontinued. 3 days later, Clement Attlee stands up in the House of Commons and tells members the decision came, in his words, without consultation and prior discussion. The figure usually given for what Lend-Lease sent Britain is $31.4 billion. Treat that number as an accounting total, not an audited one. What matters is that on the 21st of August it stops, and the ships that are already at sea still have to be paid for. Step 2. Keynes arrives in Washington and asks for a grant. He is offered a credit. On the 6th of December, 1945, the Anglo-American financial agreement is signed. $3.75 billion at 2% interest, repayable in 50 annual installments beginning on the 31st of December, 1951. A separate settlement of $650 million for the Lend-Lease goods still in the pipeline is folded in on the same terms. Total, $4.4 billion. 50 years. Final payment due in 2001. Step 3. Parliament has to vote for it, and Parliament is furious. On the 19th of July, 1946, the Conservative member Robert Boothby tells the Commons that if Britain had stood firm on the policies of justice, decency, and economic soundness in the negotiations, the Americans would have been glad to press this loan on us free of interest. He loses. The agreement passes. Step 4. March 1946. Canada extends its own credit on the same terms. $1.25 billion Canadian dollars, of which Britain will actually draw $1.185 billion. Step 5, and this is the one nobody puts in the headline. The American and Canadian loans are not the war debt. They're the loans Britain took out after the war to survive the peace. The actual war debt is somewhere else entirely. It is denominated in pounds, and it is bigger. During the war, Britain bought from the Empire and paid with paper. Indian jute, Indian soldiers, Indian rail capacity, Egyptian cotton, Egyptian labor, Egyptian ports. None of it was paid for in gold or dollars. It was paid for with credits in London, sterling balances, which the holders were told they could spend later. By 1945, those balances stand at roughly £3.5 billion. India alone holds about 1.3 billion of it. Egypt about 450 million. And here is what happens next. On the 14th of August, 1947, the day before Indian independence, Britain and India sign an agreement that blocks most of India's balance. It is not canceled. It is frozen, released in installments over years. Egypt gets a similar arrangement. The Chancellor, Hugh Dalton, tells the Commons plainly that Britain does not accept the moral validity of a large part of the Egyptian claim. He cannot get it canceled outright, so it gets blocked instead. So now hold the two things next to each other. To Washington, Britain owes $4.4 billion on a signed schedule at 2% with a date. To Delhi and Cairo, Britain owes about £3.5 billion with no schedule, no interest anyone would recognize, and no date. One of those debts got a treaty. The other got a filing cabinet. Put yourself on the other side of it for a minute, because this is where the story stops being about Britain. Imagine it is 1946, and you run a mill in Calcutta. For 6 years, you sold everything you could make to the British war effort, and you were paid properly on time, in full. The money is sitting in London, in your name, in pounds. You have not been robbed. Nobody has defaulted on you. You are on paper a creditor of one of the richest countries on earth. Now try to spend it. You cannot take it out. The balance is blocked, released in installments, on a timetable London writes. You cannot convert it into dollars to buy American machinery, because Britain does not have the dollars and will not let you have them. You cannot even hold it and wait for a better moment, because the one thing you are not allowed to do is choose the moment. So you hold pounds. Not because you decided to, because there is no other door. Remember that, because in 3 years' time something's going to happen to the pound, and you will still be holding it. This is the first chart in this video, and it is here because you now know what to look for. This is British gross public debt as a share of the economy on the International Monetary Fund's long-run series from 1800 to today. 2 mountains. The first is the Napoleonic Wars. On this series, it tops out at 260.9% in 1821. The second is the one we are here for. 1938, before the war, 155%. Britain has not finished paying for the previous war yet. 1946, 269.8%. The highest reading in the entire 225-year series. Be careful with that number, and I will be careful with it too. Britain's own official bodies do not agree on it. The Office for Budget Responsibility has published both around 270% and 249% for the same peak in different documents, and work using the Bank of England's Millennium dataset puts it at 259. They're measuring slightly different things, gross against net, calendar year against financial year. The chart on your screen is the IMF series, and I am reading it exactly as is published. Whichever of those numbers you take, the shape is identical, and the shape is the point. Now, watch the right-hand side of the second mountain. 1951, the first installment on the American loan, 196.8%. 1960, 117.9. 1970, 73.4. 1976, 47.7. 222 points of national income, gone in 30 years. Now ask the only question that matters. Who paid that off? 18th of September, 1949. A Sunday evening. Sir Stafford Cripps, the Chancellor, goes on the wireless and tells the country that the pound has been devalued against the dollar. From $4.03 to $2.80. That is a cut of 30.5%, announced in a broadcast, effective at once. For a British household, this is expensive and confusing. Imported goods cost more. Exports get cheaper. It is a normal, brutal 20th century policy decision, and you can argue about whether it was the right one. For the man in Calcutta, it is something else. His balance is in pounds. Overnight, without a vote, without a negotiation, without so much as a letter, the dollars he could theoretically eventually buy with his blocked British credit have fallen by nearly a third. He has not been robbed. He has not been defaulted on. The number in his account is exactly the same number it was on Saturday. It just buys 30% less of the thing he wanted it for. And then, 18 years later, it happens again. 18th of November, 1967. Harold Wilson's government devalues from $2.80 to $2.40. Another 14.3%. Wilson goes on television that evening and tells the country that the pound in your pocket has not been devalued. A sentence so precisely wrong that it outlived his entire government. And notice something about who is in the room for these decisions. The Cabinet is. The Treasury is. The Bank of England is. The International Monetary Fund is consulted. The people holding several billion pounds of blocked sterling balances in Delhi and Cairo are not consulted because there is no mechanism by which they could be. They are not creditors with leverage. They are creditors with paperwork. Now here is the part that makes this an accounting story rather than a morality tale. And it is the part one want you to be able to check yourself. If a debt shrinks from 270% of the economy to 48, the obvious explanation is that somebody paid it down. So let us look at the top of the fraction on its own. This is British gross public debt measured not as a percentage of anything, but in pounds. It starts in 1960 because 1960 is the first year the World Bank publishes British national output in pounds, and I am not going to draw a line through years I cannot source. 1960, 30.8 billion pounds owed. 1970, 40 billion. 1976, 61.7 billion. In the 16 years in which the debt ratio fell from 118% to 48, the steepest stretch of the whole decline, The amount Britain owed in pounds exactly doubled. Nobody repaid anything. The debt got bigger. What happened in those 16 years is that British consumer prices rose by a factor of about 3.2. Every pound of 1960 debt was still a pound. It was just a pound that bought a third of what it used to. So this is not a story about a mistake Britain made. Britain's arithmetic worked perfectly. The mistake belongs to everyone who ended up holding the other end of it. And the mistake was not greed or stupidity. It was accepting a promise denominated in a currency the other party controls. That is the whole error. It looks like a technicality when you sign it. 29th of September, 1976. Britain's debt ratio is at 47.7% of national income, the lowest it has been since before the First World War. By the measure every finance ministry is judged on, the war debt is beaten. That same day, the British government applies to the International Monetary Fund for a standby credit of $3.9 billion. It is the largest sum the fund has ever been asked for by anyone. The pound is falling. Inflation the previous year had been 24.2%, the highest in the World Bank's entire series for Britain, and this year it is 16.6. The mechanism that dissolved the war debt has not switched off. It is still running, and now it is eating the country that built it. On the 15th of December, the Chancellor, Denis Healey, signs a letter of intent committing Britain to cuts in public spending and tells the House of Commons that Britain is being very generously treated by the IMF. There is a sentence you can construct out of nothing but verified facts, and it is the most uncomfortable sentence in this story. In the same year that Britain finished shrinking the debt it had run up to win the Second World War, it had to go to the international lender of last resort to keep the lights on. The trick worked. That is not the same as it having been a plan. And now the part that comes after the ending. Because the mechanism did not only reprice the debts of foreigners. Look at what it did at home. This is British inflation year by year from 1960. On the official retail prices index, the number for 1946 is 27. For 1976, it is 157. 1 pound of 1946 money is worth about 17 pence by 1976. A pound saved by a soldier who came home in 1945 and left in a post office account and never touched, lost more than 80% of what it could buy before he reached retirement. He was not a foreign creditor. He was the person the war debt had been borrowed on behalf of. So here is the honest accounting of who paid off Britain's Second World War debt. The United States and Canada were paid in full, with interest to the cent, $7.5 billion to Washington and $2 billion to Ottawa across 56 years. They were the only creditors who got the whole thing. India and Egypt and every other holder of blocks sterling were paid in pounds that lost 30% of their dollar value in 1949 and another 14% in 1967 and lost value against goods every single year in between. And British savers, pensioners and bondholders, the people who had actually lent the government the money by buying war bonds out of patriotism, were repaid every penny they were promised in money worth a fraction of what they lent. Nobody was cheated. Everybody was repaid. Look at what they were repaid with. So, the two questions. How does a country get rid of a debt worth 270% of its economy without repaying it? It leaves the top of the fraction alone and makes the bottom bigger, partly by growing, mostly by letting prices rise, and it lets 30 years do the work. The pounds owed went up. The burden went down. That is the mechanism, and every government that borrows in its own currency has it, including yours. And who paid for it? Not the Americans, who were paid in dollars on a signed schedule. Not the Canadians, same. The bill went to everyone holding a promise written in pounds and not permitted to leave. The sterling balances of Delhi and Cairo, and the savings accounts of British households who had bought war bonds because they were asked to. Which brings us back to the 29th of December, 2006. That $83 million payment was real. Ed Balls, the economic secretary to the Treasury, said that week that Britain was finally honoring in full its commitments to the United States and Canada for the support they gave 60 years ago. Every word of that is accurate. It is also the only commitment in this story that was written in somebody else's currency, and therefore the only one that could not be quietly made smaller. Where is this today? On the same IMF series, British public debt is back at 101.3% of national income in 2024. The United States is at 122.3%, France at 113.1%. And in every one of those countries, the debt is a fixed number of the government's own money, and the government picks the people who print it. So here is what I actually want to know. If you had been a man in Calcutta in 1946, told your money was safe in London and simply not available yet, at what point would you have called that a debt rather than a theft? And what exactly would you have done instead?